This is the English Dialect Survey. For the first time, we've managed to travel back in time to procure a recording of Middle English. So this is an anecdote from William Shaw from the Kent-London border, recorded on the 15th of May 1390.
At Trumpington, not far from Canterbury, there stand a mill upon a brook, and the miller there was prude and gay as any peacock, and strong. His face was round, flat nose, skull as pillid as an ape. He was a thief of meal and corn, and this is where I saw. His name was Horton Simkin. And then were the twa young clerkes, poverty young clerkes, and they crew upon the wardain to give him leave to go to mill, and the durst lay her neck, the miller should not steal him any corn. They were Horton, John and Alain, and they were born fair in the north, he cannot tell where. And at the mill, John lathy doon the sack, and spark Simkin, "Be me lief, who knew, what do you here?" And quoth John, "We hope to grind oor corn, he pray you spare us heden that ye may." And quoth Simkin, "It shall be done, what will ye done while it is in hand?" And quoth John, "He will stand richt by the hopper and say who that the corn goes in." He never saw yet who that the hopper wags till and fra. And quoth Alain, "John, will thou swear, then will he be there, and say who that the mail falls down into the trough?" And quoth he is as ill a miller as are ye. And thought the miller all this but for a wheel. Thought the miller, the more crackers that they make, the more will he steal. And he goeth out at the door, and found the clerk's horse he boon behind the mill under a leather cell, and straped off the bridle. And the horse was loose, wahey, toward the fen. Horse. Hello. These kinds of videos often get views from people who haven't been on my channel before, so if you haven't been, I'm Simon Roper. I've been making YouTube videos about historical linguistics for a long time. I've got a couple of tangentially relevant degrees. I also make films, often with a focus on extremely naturalistic and accurate historical dialogue, and I dialect coach on films of various scales, where I've also sometimes incorporated some historical elements into the dialect. So every so often I'll do one of these videos where I try to present our best reconstruction of the pronunciation of a particular stage in the history of English, and I'll try and do it through a very naturalistic anecdote or something like that. And I'd been watching, in the course of researching for videos, I've been watching a lot of, or listening to a lot of, old dialect recordings from dialect surveys in the 50s, 60s, and sometimes even earlier. And often in these dialect surveys you have a rural speaker who's relatively old, just telling an anecdote in their own native dialect. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we had such a thing from Middle English? Middle English is the period of English that stretches from roughly the Norman Conquest to something called the Great Vowel Shift. So very roughly from about 1150, well, earlier than that if you're being strict, sort of 1066 until 14 or 1500. And I think it's a very interesting period of English to do one of these videos on, because I think especially late Middle English, the kind of Middle English that Geoffrey Chaucer was writing in, is a point where it's just about not quite like any modern dialect. For this video I wanted to be as idiomatically accurate to Middle English speech as possible. So what I did was I went into the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. I went to the Reeves Tale, which is one of my favourites, and I took a segment from the start of the Reeves Tale, shortened it, and tried to rearrange it so that it didn't rhyme and it didn't seem obviously like a poem. And wherever I needed to bring in extra sentence constructions in order to do that, I tried to only use sentence constructions that were in the surrounding text. So I think this is certainly idiomatically appropriate to Middle English. Obviously it's debatable how far Chaucer was actually using completely natural language, you could easily imagine him choosing a word that a normal person wouldn't use in order to tide over the meter or something. Although I think there is a case to be made that he was at least trying to make it resemble normal speech, because at times when he mentions that characters have particular regional dialects, he will often make choices in their dialogue that reflect those regional dialects. That's why I like the Reeves Tales so much, because John and Alain are supposed to be from the north, specifically from, well, he says he can't tell where they're from, but I think they're from like Strother, which I think is a place name from sort of County Durham kind of area in the far northeast of England. And there are things which appear to be northern dialect forms in their speech. I had thought about having the character performing the anecdote try to slip into a Middle English northern accent while he was reading these lines. I eventually decided not to do that because this video was taking too long to make, and there are aspects of northern pronunciation that are a little bit shaky from that time. But nonetheless, the northern dialect forms are still in there. One of the big choices Chaucer made in these bits of dialogue was using the letter A in certain words rather than O. In Chaucer's general prose you get saw, fra, ga, and in the northern dialogue you get swa, fra, ga. This is a commonly attested south-north difference in Middle English, as is the northern use of till rather than to. And all these differences leave their mark on traditional dialects nowadays. A less obvious north-south difference is in how verbs are conjugated. The northerners consistently use the modern-like s as a suffix for verbs conjugated in the third person. Here I've said gas, wags, fowls, although it's possible that there was an extra vowel in some of these, as opposed to the southern garth, laith, strepeth, although it's possible that that unstressed final th was voiced, garth, laith, strepeth. This s ending is more normal across English nowadays. We say goes, falls, runs. The th or uth ending, as in goeth, falleth, strippeth, has since died out, but this was a big north-south difference in Middle English. Another thing that might be obscured for a modern reader is how Chaucer flips back and forth between the present and past tense, something that I think is fairly normal in modern anecdote telling, but might not be expected as much in formal prose. For example, Dan went to the shop yesterday and he goes up to the shopkeeper and says, etc. In terms of pronunciation, I've largely gone from this fantastic book here to produce a late 14th century system of pronunciation appropriate to the southeast, which is probably fairly unsurprising to most people who've studied Middle English phonology. You have the 5 short vowels as in sack, fen, mill, hopper, and skull, and the 7 long vowels as in fas, mel, se, leaf, goth, soth, and prud. These long vowels are the ones that generally surprise people a bit more because they're very different to the modern vowels in these words for most dialects of English. I've done another video going into some detail about why that is. Many words and syllables take this weak vowel, This is of course true in modern English and many other Germanic language varieties. The phrase into the villa, in my accent, has 3 such instances of this weak vowel, into the villa. This vowel can occur in unstressed syllables of important content words like villa, or in smaller function words that are entirely unstressed within the context of the sentence, like the. In the latter case, we call those weak forms, where a function word presents a choice between a stressed form and an unstressed form, the versus the, but versus but, to versus t, you versus y. Different dialects of modern English have slightly different sets of weak forms. Dr. Jeff Lindsay has covered weak forms in a few of his videos. So one of my big questions while I made this video was, did Middle English have these optional weak forms, and how did they work? The answer is important because having weak forms like modern English ones makes it sound a lot more familiar to us. So whether it sounded familiar or not is obviously important in an impressionistic reconstruction like this one. I think the evidence as presented in this fantastic book definitely leans in favour of weakening in these unstressed function words and optional weak and strong forms of the same word, like in modern English. We're fairly sure that this could change the length or quality of the vowel in the word. For example, the word tor in its strong form has a long vowel, or, which if shortened would become to. I'm using a slightly lower vowel quality because the closest short vowel to or was o. But did you have the full neutralisation that you have in modern English, where the weak forms of the Middle English words tor and there would have the same vowel as each other, t, the? I think there's some hint that this might have been happening at least to a limited extent. The authors point to examples where what would normally be wiltu is contracted to wilter, saistu is contracted to saister. This is something that still happens in conservative Northern English dialects, where older speakers still use thou as a pronoun. You could interpret this as the oo of thu becoming an e, wilte, saiste, but I think it's more likely that it just became neutralised to something more central, like You see how the tongue is very lax and central when you say For one thing, this specific change only seems to have happened in low-stress situations. It's not some systematic sound change that always affected the oo sound, and so the vowel adopting a more lax central tongue position seems a lot more consistent with that than the vowel jumping all the way to the front of the vowel space and keeping a very peripheral tense tongue position. In addition to that, these contractions are spelled and treated as one word, where thu has just become a final unstressed syllable of the previous word, rather than a word in its own right. And we have other reasons to think that in word final unstressed position, the letter E represented a fairly lax vowel, something like or maybe I. So this would be a convenient way for the writer to represent a pronunciation like wilter, seister. Well, I think that's enough for this video, but I'm very slowly working on a much longer Middle English pronunciation video to be released at some point. Again, if for any reason you want to incorporate some historical dialect stuff into a film, or dialect stuff in general, I'll give my professional contact information in the description. Most recently, I've been lucky enough to work on The Dreadful with Sophie Turner, Kit Harington and Marcia Gay Harden, directed by the fantastic Natasha Kamani, whose directing style I was very enthusiastic about. And I'll also be tutoring on this year's summer course in English phonetics at UCL, thanks to my good friend Dr. Jeff Lindsay, whose channel I'd also highly recommend. Thank you if you choose to subscribe on the basis of this video, and thank you to all my patrons who make these videos so much easier to have the time to produce. Until next time, I'll leave you with the version with subtitles.
At Trumpington, not far from Canterbury, there stand a mill upon a brook, and the miller there was prude and gay as any peacock, and strong. His face was round, flat nose, skull as pillid as an ape. He was a thief of meal and corn, and this is where I saw it. His name was Horton Simkin. And then were the two young clerks, poverty young clerks, and I crew upon the wardain to give him leave to go to mill, and the durst lay her neck, the miller should not steal him any corn. And they were Horton, John and Aline, and they were born fair in the north, he cannot tell where. And at the mill, John Lythy doing the sack, and spark Simkin, "Be me lief, who knew, what do you here?" And quoth John, "We hope to grind our corn, he pray you spare us heden that you may." And quoth Simkin, "It shall be done, what will you done while it is in hand?" And quoth John, "He will stand right by the hopper and say who that the corn goes in." He never saw yet who that the hopper wags till and fra. And quoth Aline, "John, will thou swear, then will he be there, and say who that the mail falls down into the trough?" And quoth he is as ill a miller as are ye. And thought the miller all this but for a wheel. Thought the miller, the more crackers that they make, the more will he steal. And he goes out at the door, and found the clerk's horse bone behind the mill under the leather cell, and stripped off the bridle. And the horse was loose, way toward the fen. Horse oath.